Hello, friend. Thanks for joining me for another book chat. Today, let's spend a few minutes with A Room with a View by E.M. Forster. This book was originally published in 1908. This is a reread for me. I read this book originally probably about 30 years ago, so it was long overdue for a reread for me. It was adapted into a film back in 1985. It was a Merchant and Ivory, really lush period production. That was really a fantastic adaptation of this book, and that's also due for a rewatch by me soon. I should get to that soon. So this book kind of functions on two different levels, I think. One, it's a romance, and two, it is a social critique of the period. So, spoilers. I don't really think this book is that spoiler driven, but nevertheless, I will be careful to not give away anything that would detract from a first time reader's experience with this book. So don't worry about that if you have never read it. So, this book's setting, the setting is from the time around 1908, around the time it was published. And as the novel kicks off, we find our main characters in Italy, in Florence, Italy. As the novel opens, Miss Lucy Honeychurch is touring Italy with her older cousin, the fussy Charlotte Bartlett, who is acting as her chaperone. So they are staying in sort of a boarding house thing for English tourists, and they are still basically in England, even though they're in Florence in that sense. So as the novel opens, Lucy and Charlotte are looking over their rooms at this boarding house, which is called a pensione or something like that. And they're unhappy because they had been promised rooms with a view of the River Arno, but their rooms are overlooking this sort of bleak little courtyard. So Lucy's older cousin, though, is the type of person who is, she's this fussy type of person that creates confusion and anxiety basically over everything. And so this room issue is no different, where she's fussing over that. There is this father and son also at the pensione, Mr. Emerson and his son George, who the other residents consider unconventional, and they're treated quite coldly by the other guests there at the pensione. They are suspected of being socialists and possibly even atheists. So they're not really approved of. Miss Bartlett immediately doesn't approve of them, and Lucy's also very skeptical of them. Well, Mr. Emerson actually overhears the drama about the rooms, and he offers to exchange rooms with Lucy and Charlotte because his room and his son George's room have views of the River Arno. Well, Lucy thinks the offer's okay, but of course Charlotte has to make confusion out of it, and she's not inclined to accept it because she feels like this will put her and Lucy under an unseemly obligation to the Emersons, who, as I mentioned, are not well thought of. So an unseemly obligation. Mr. Beebe, who's a vicar also staying there at the pensione, persuades Miss Bartlett, though, to go ahead and accept the offer. She, however, ensures that Lucy gets Mr. Emerson's room while she takes George's room because she feels like it would be improper for Lucy to have the young man's former room. So yeah, she's all about the convention. So you see what I mean here with a social critique of the period. So not like the Emersons, who are really unconventional people, there's another character there in the pensione, Miss Lavish, who is a person who considers herself unconventional, but she's the kind of unconventional person that conventional people find to be acceptable. So Miss Lavish is writing a novel, and she determines that she's going to show Lucy the real Florence. So during one such excursion where she's showing Lucy the real Florence, Miss Lavish basically abandons her, and so Lucy's a bit lost because she doesn't have her guidebook because Miss Lavish took her guidebook since it was prohibiting her from seeing the real Florence. So Lucy's sort of lost in this church, and she comes across the Emersons, Mr. Emerson and his son George. And it is ultimately George then who shows Lucy a bit about real life. The real Italy is actually eventually seen through Lucy finds a bit of that through George. And I think that's all that I'll say about that right now, because I don't want to give away any spoilers. So the second part of the book, though, we find ourselves back in England. We're in the community where the Honeychurch family lives. I will say for the first part of the book, Lucy and Miss Bartlett bring back a secret from the first part of the book from Italy, something that happens there in Italy that Lucy and Miss Bartlett do not want the people back home to know about, so they do have this between them when they return back to their small town. So I don't think I mentioned that Lucy is engaged. So we, at this point in the book, we do meet her fiancé Cecil. And Cecil is a huge boor and snob. I mean, that's just nothing else to say about it other than that. He's the type of person who laughs at everyone, sort of behind their back, around, as being too unsophisticated. And Lucy, when she's around him, she's really a worse person, I think. Mr. Beebe, the vicar, who we met initially in the first part of the book, he also lives in this community. And there is a cottage to be let nearby, near where the Honeychurches live. And there's some anxiety there about who's going to take the cottage. And we learn that Mr. Beebe, the vicar, has actually arranged that the Emersons, Mr. Emerson and George, would take the cottage. And of course, this sort of turns her little world that she has back in England upside down. So I don't think I will go into any more about that either, due to spoilers, about how that ultimately all plays out and what the secret was that they brought back to England from Italy. All right, so just some thoughts about the book, though. So the social conventions, I mentioned, the restrictive social conventions of this era are really well illustrated in this book, and I think this is really cool because this book was written in 1908, so it's a first-hand account of this sort of conventions. And I think that through the characters of the Emersons, he's showing that there are those in society who are rejecting these sort of these values and living a different way, even though there are those like Miss Lavish who are fashionably rejecting them, but nevertheless still actually supporting them. Mr. Emerson is one of the most enjoyable characters for me in the book. He has raised his son George as a single parent, and he raised him unconventionally on purpose. And the downside of that is that George has grown up without the kind of framework for living that others around him have, for example, that Lucy has, where there's an expectation of what to do next or how to behave. He doesn't have that. So he feels, I think he can feel like a bit lost and alienated. And Mr. Emerson, his father, is actually worried about him, and this is one of the reasons why he wanted to move to this community, he thought it would be good for George's mental health. So Miss Bartlett, so I've already talked a bit about her and how she's basically the opposite of Mr. Emerson. She makes everything more complicated because she obsesses over the rightness of things. And in her pursuit of rightness, she makes everything far more complicated and anxiety producing. There's a scene in the book where I think she's either trying to pay a delivery person or give a tip or something like that. And she doesn't have she's got a bill, she doesn't have the change, and someone else offers to give the tip or pay the bill, and she won't hear of it because she feels like it's her duty to do. So everybody has to scramble around trying to break a bill for her. So in other words, she takes a very small situation and due to obsessing over the rightness of it, creates far more confusion than was actually needed for that. There's a chapter with a title that I just love. Chapter 13, How Miss Bartlett's Boiler Was So Tiresome. Oh, I thought that was so funny. So I wanted to touch on this bathing scene that's in the book too that I thought was really beautiful. So Lucy's younger brother Freddie and Mr. Beebe go to meet the Emersons when they first move into this cottage in the neighborhood. And Freddie just is this sort of free-spirited young man, and he just randomly asks George, like, let's go bathe in this pond that's nearby. So they do, and when they get to the pond, there had been a rain, and so the pond had extra water in it. And the way that it's described in the book, the pond is almost this sort of mystical. Becomes almost this mystical place where the two young men then start to bathe. They actually convince Mr. Beebe also to join them, and they sort of frolic and play like in the spirit of youth and vitality, and in this magical place. And then they Mrs. Honeychurch and Lucy end up coming up on them while they're doing this, but that's beside the point. But there's a quote that sort of describes that scene that I thought was pretty cool. And it says, that evening and all that night the water ran away. On the morrow the pool had shrunk to its old size and lost its glory. It had been a call to the blood and to the relaxed will, a passing benediction whose influence did not pass, a holiness, a spell, a momentary chalice for youth. So this pond then is sort of an opposite of the restricted social conventions that most of the characters are in throughout most of the book. All right, so I think I will close with this quote that I thought was really beautiful. This quote is George talking to Mrs. Honeychurch, and he says, there is a certain amount of kindness, just as there's a certain amount of light, he continued in measured tones. We cast a shadow on something wherever we stand, and it is no good moving from place to place to save things, because the shadow always follows. Choose a place where you won't do harm. Yes, choose a place where you won't do very much harm, and stand in it for all you are worth, facing the sunshine. I thought that was really a beautiful quote. That's a nice way to end this chat. I enjoyed rereading this. It was basically almost a new read for me because it's been so long since I read it. And I do plan to read more E.M. Forster novels in the future, so stay tuned for that. However, my next chat is going to be Lavinia by Ursula K. Le Guin. And I have finished this already, so I will have a chat on it coming up soon. Until next time, take care.